Okay, Counterculture Part 2, Bringing It All Back Home. Hopefully you're familiar with that title. It is from Dylan's trilogy from 65 and 66, which was not only a transformation of his music, but a transformation of American music in general, transformation of counterculture, transformation in the New Left, transformation in many ways in American history. Highway 61 revisited, Bringing It All Back Home, and Blonde on Blonde represent a larger change. Now we're going to get to that. But Bob Dylan, of course, the voice of the generation, that's what we always hear. But again, in many ways, he would both lead and reflect what we see in American culture in the 1960s. A few of his major songs, of course, The Times They Are A-Changin', Blowin' in the Wind, Like a Rolling Stone. The main themes of these songs, there are some things we just don't know. Maybe authority is not always correct. Maybe we need to change how things are done. For example, what does it really mean to become a man? Now, the difference between the first two, The Times They Are A-Changin', Blowin' in the Wind, and the third, Like a Rolling Stone, is again this transformation to the electric sound. Like a Rolling Stone was when Dylan went electric. It was the first song on Highway 61 Revisited, and again, it would change American music, period. Whether you like him or not, he changed American music. Now, in many ways, Dylan, I think, represents the 1960s better than any other cultural figure, and you'll find many historians who say you cannot talk about the 1960s without talking about Dylan. Again, I think he represented the era better than folks like Timothy Leary, the hippies, Tom Hayden, even the Beatles. And he would influence the Beatles. Consider their work 1967 and after, again, much more psychedelic. They touched upon social and political issues. They did hang out together. Of course, drugs. There was the theory that Dylan gave the Beatles their first joint, that everything changed after that. Not necessarily true. He did do drugs with them, but he didn't. He did not introduce them to marijuana by any stretch. Dylan grew up in Minnesota as Robert Zimmerman. He tried various projects, etc., in high school and college, but was attracted to a burgeoning folky scene. He would come to Greenwich Village in New York in search of stardom as a folkie. He quickly found it, earning the praises of folks like Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, many others. He wrote great songs. Some were political, some were social in nature. Later, he would get more into psychedelia and eventually turn to the theme most important in most music, and that is love. It's more in the 1970s. We'll get to that. Freewheelin' came out in 1963. This reflected his songwriting prowess. It was an acoustic album, just him and his guitar and his harmonica. This would feature songs like Blowin' in the Wind, Masters of War, an anti-war song a bit ahead of its time, especially when you think 1963 in Vietnam. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, talking World War III blues, and I Shall Be Free. Now, there was a lot going on here. This was his second album, and this is the one that skyrocketed him to fame. Major themes, again, love, war, social issues, race, class, in songs like Girl from North County and Oxford Town. For example, Oxford Town around the bend. He'd come into the door, he couldn't get in, all because of the color of his skin. What do you think about that, my friend? And the sexuality on the song I Shall Be Free. Well, I took me a woman late last night. I was 3/4 drunk. She looked all right. Started peeling off her onion gook, took off her wig, and said, "How do I look?" I was high flying, bare naked, out the window. Dylan could laugh. Of course, politics, idealism. Well, my telephone rang. It would not stop. It was President Kennedy calling me up. He said, "My friend Bob, what do we need to make the country grow?" And I said, "My friend John, Bridget Bardot or Sophia Loren." Again, fun stuff. And he dealt with race. I was out there painting on the old wood shed when a can of black paint fell on my head, went down to scrub and rub, but I had to sit in back of the tub. Now, obviously, the civil rights movement is in full gear at this time, but there are not many American musicians who are focusing on this with their music. You do have plenty of Blame America First writers at this time. Woody Guthrie would be an example. Dylan doesn't necessarily approach it like that. Again, he approaches kind of the irony of our living in a free society where not all are free, but he is very nuanced, very subtle about how he goes about it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in 65 and 66, Dylan would release three of the most important albums in rock history. Yes, I said it. It is not hyperbole. The changes associated with these three records would both reflect larger changes and help to initiate larger changes in music, society, and culture. I mentioned previously he was acoustic. He focused on folk songs and methods, melodic and simple somewhat, and somewhat peaceful music. It was not aggressive at all. With Highway 61 Revisited, Bringing It All Back Home, and Blonde on Blonde, he went electric. He was criticized by the folk scene. They believed he was selling out. For Dylan, though, this new aggressive style reflected what was going on in the country. And we see this in many ways. The 1960s started off as idealistic, as Camelot, as we can do anything. This was reinforced by the idealism associated with Kennedy, by the initial positivism of the student movement. When I say positivism, of course, I don't mean empiricism. I mean optimism, if you will. But the nonviolence and civil disobedience of the civil rights movement and its initial successes also is part of this. But by the mid-1960s, people were getting a little bit more impatient. They wanted more immediate, aggressive change. You see the rise of Black Power a little bit later with Stokely Carmichael, of course, Malcolm X, By Any Means Necessary, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They became more in your face, more militant, louder, more fierce. Dylan's electric songs reflected this. No longer was it just acoustic guitar and harmonica. It was now electric guitar, bass, organ, and drums. Still, many of the themes were the same. For example, you've each watched the video of Subterranean Homesick Blues, the restlessness that we see with that, kind of the stream of consciousness thought. Desolation Row. This one included the folly and hypocrisy of much of what was going on. Segregation, focus on class, conformity, folly of authority. A few lyrics from that. Now at midnight, all the agents and the superhuman crew come out and round up everyone that knows more than they do. Then they bring them back to the factory where the heart attack machine is strapped to their shoulders, and then the kerosene is brought down from the castles by insurance men who go check to see that nobody is escaping from Desolation Row. From Bob Dylan's 115th Dream, well, I rapped upon a house with a U.S. flag upon display. I said, could you help me out? I've got some friends down the way. The man said, get out of here or I'll tear you limb from limb. I said, you know, they refuse Jesus too. And he said, yeah, but you're not him. Get out of here before I break your bones. Again, kind of the hypocrisy of what we often see in society. Ballad of a Thin Man, and in that song he articulated a lack of awareness among adults in authority as they are witnessing a rebellious youth, but they cannot explain why. They're bewildered. They didn't know how to act, which leads to the lyric, and you know something is happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Again, kind of showing this, just the lack of understanding of authority of the older generation, of this disconnect, the oblivious nature of these connections, of these relations between older and younger generations. This famous concert in Manchester in 1966, I thought it was Royal Albert Hall, but it wasn't. I'm sorry, I just actually was watching a video on this the other day. But in Manchester, and I guess let me go back here a little bit. 1966, he conducts a major tour of England. And in this tour, he plays one set acoustic, which makes the folk people very happy. But then he has one set of electric music. And he is met with boos, with many people who are unhappy because, again, they want him to stick to the traditional folky style. At this particular concert in 1966, when he's showing his new direction, after his at the end of his electric set, again, he is not received affectionately from those who love folk music, thought he had sold out. They wanted the old Dylan, the blowing in the wind Dylan only. After he completes, again, most of this electric set, and after Ballad of Thin Man, the last song is Like a Rolling Stone. Prior to the song, someone calls out from the crowd, Judas. Many people clap. He responds, I don't believe you. You're a liar. Then they turn in one of the most rocking versions of one of the greatest rock songs ever. And you can hear him turn to his band and say, play it loud. Dylan did not care what the masses wanted. Dylan is the one who constructed culture. He is the one who led the change. What is that song about? Like a Rolling Stone. Again, I'm going to share a link to this version of it. You can hear all this go on, and he is at his most intense. The song, like a Rolling Stone, is about change. It's about stepping out into a new world in which folk songs are no longer falling, or in which folks are no longer falling at your side. You realize you may not have known what exactly you were doing or saying. The sudden anonymity of life, the lack of the individual in the face of mass society and mass culture. The main lyric, how does it feel to be on your own with no direction home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? Again, with all these changes in America, he's reflecting this anonymity, this sense of selflessness of who am I in this big world. Now, I've mentioned some of these songs again, Blowing in the Wind, The Times They Are a-Changin'. These have become staples in modern culture. Many bands have covered these songs, of course, and I remember when my youngest daughter was watching Blues Clues once, they had The Times They Are a-Changin' on there. That shows that he went from counterculture to popular culture in a big way. Now, after these three amazing records, he gets into a motorcycle accident and we see more change. He goes from liberal politics to cultural radicalism, going electric in the mid-60s. Again, he gets in your face. In many ways, this reflects the new aggressive nature of the student movement, of the growing militancy of the civil rights movement, of an intensifying women's movement that will not sit back and let people do what they want. Again, he gets in this motorcycle accident in early 67. He disappears for months. When he comes back out, again, we're talking 1967. We're talking the summer of love. We're talking Woodstock. We're talking Sgt. Pepper's. We're talking hippie, hippie, hippie everywhere. What does he come out with? He comes out with an album called John Wesley Harding. Now, it's a bit political. It deals with social stuff, but most of it is about historical storytelling, complete with a new country sound. Totally in the face of everything else that's going on at this time. You even have Led Zeppelin and their heavy metal. Again, you have the psychedelia of the San Francisco scene. You've got the hippies. You've got the Grateful Dead. You've got Jefferson Airplane. You've got the band Love. If you've ever heard their album Forever Changes, a great instrument from the '60s to tell you what was going on. But here you've got Dylan in the face of all this comes out with a country record, John Wesley Harding. It's on this record that he shared the song All Along the Watchtower. Now, Hendrix's version is considered the great one, and even Dylan likes Hendrix's version better. But if you have a chance, you need to listen to Dylan's version. The same thing with the Hendrix song, but the lyrics, nobody's writing lyrics like that anymore. Now, I say Harding is a country album. It also is part of his larger turn inward. But Scott, we're talking about the 60s. How did this reflect changes that are going on? Much like many movements that would toward the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, as the country falls apart, the dreams of the early 1960s are evaporating, many people would turn inward. And we see this especially in the 1970s. Dylan was out ahead of the curve again. This inward turn would meet its crescendo with his album Blood on the Tracks in 1975, an incredibly personal album about love and heartbreak, dealing with the specific breakup with his wife, Sarah. In many ways, this too would reflect the mentality of the 1970s. Again, a turn inward, a new concern over personal and interpersonal health, a turn away from the destruction of politics and war and economy. Even though you have increasing radical political movements in the late 60s and in the early 70s, again, what will these all transform into? A more inward-looking 1970s. Less active politics, less being active out in the community, etc. People were looking inward. That's where you have consciousness raising. You have more of these communes. People are lost. They are looking for some kind of sense of direction. Many of you have probably heard about the key parties, where a couple would come to a party, they'd put the keys in a big jar. At the end of the night, the wife would pick out a pair of keys, and whoever's keys they were, that's the man she would go home with. Because again, they were looking for some kind of sense of what am I doing, direction, a sense of hope. So, getting back to the great one, Bob Dylan, again, what we see in the 1960s starts with folk music, goes into electric music, turns inward toward the end, very much reflects what we see in the culture, in popular culture even, and in American society at this time. I cannot overestimate the impact he had not only on music but on culture as well. He was the voice of his generation, but he very much directed where that generation was going. Not consciously, but again, he reflected much of that. So we get to the 60s again. I've talked about a few great records, all those that I mentioned regarding Dylan. You get to the Beatles again, the album The Beatles, or Sgt. Pepper's, or Revolver, the Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, and what later would come out as Smile, I'm sorry, decades later, Love Forever Changes. Of course, CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival, their song Fortunate Son, very much reflected the anti-war movement and the sense of class disparity, and the sense of despair that many of working class members felt. One thing that's interesting, if you ever listen to CCR, one thing that's interesting is there is a lot of Marxism in Fogerty's lyrics. Just check it out when you get a chance. I'm trying to think of a few other songs off the top of my head. I can't, of course, but well, just check them out. So there you go. Counterculture, Bob Dylan. He was bringing it all back home.